So, Professor JOYCE TAIT from Innogen is going to talk to us about predicting complex futures, the role of regulation, health technology, foresight, in which JOYCE has got extensive experience, both in terms of the academic side of things, but also in terms of policy advice. So hopefully the interpretation you'll give us will be extremely realistic.
Yes, yes. Like some of the previous speakers, I'm a confirmed pragmatist.
Very brutal then.
I'm probably not as brutal as some. and I should, my name is on this slide at the bottom there, but I should add that the work that I'm going to describe was done mainly with Joanna Chataway and David Weald, who are both at the Open University. Well, David Weald's now back in Edinburgh, but Joanna's still at the Open University. And it was really the three of us thinking around a range of different projects that came up with the ideas that contributed to this. So I really must give them credit for this as well. And I want to mention to begin with an OECD scenario paper which we developed earlier this year. It's on OECD's website. The OECD liked the form of analysis that we had developed over a long period of years and asked us to apply it to this scenario. And the paper I'm going to give today kind of describes how we got to this point and what we did in terms of applying our ideas imaginatively to this basic question: what will the bioeconomy look like in 2030 as far as healthcare is concerned? And it was a very unusual contract from the OECD in that they told us to be as imaginative as possible and as unconstrained in our thinking as possible. And anybody who knows OECD will know that that's a very unusual remit to get from them. So we looked at some really radical scenarios for the future. And we based it on this approach to doing this kind of research that we've actually evolved since I did my PhD in the 1970s looking at the agrochemical industry and farmers' use of pesticides, then moving in the 1980s into GM crops when the agrochemical industry moved into GM crops as their main innovation area, and then following on the success with that, where we were, I'll mention in a minute, we've applied it over the last 5 years to the health sector and applied the ideas in a new area. Now, we kind of made this up as we went along over the years, and we developed this as a methodology for studying complexity, I guess, not studying the complexity per se, but taking account of the complexity in the questions you were asked to research and so on. And when we were working on GM crops in the 1980s, totally fortuitously, we were able to get 3 grants from 3 different bodies looking at each of these different areas. So we had 1 grant looking at industry strategies, 1 looking at regulation, and the other one looking at public and stakeholder concerns, mainly farmers and public attitudes and so on. And what we were able to do as a result of having these 3 projects going at once, those of us who were in charge were able to link the ideas together. And what we developed was a way of trying to predict what would happen in terms of what products actually reached the marketplace at the end of the day by looking at how these 3 different sectors were interacting with one another. And it's rather nice when your predictions prove to be accurate, and these are the only ones that generally get mentioned again. We have a paper in the House of Lords Select Committee report, which was dated 1992, I think, where we predicted what would happen in European responses to biotechnology and GM crops in 1998. And when we did that report in 1992, the Department of Trade and Industry, who funded part of it, said, "We don't wish to know this, we don't like your results, we're not going to publish them." And industry said, "Oh, JOYCE TAIT's gone over to the other side, we're not going to talk to her anymore." And it wasn't until 1998, when things actually went badly wrong, that people came back and said, "Tell us what to do about it," which was quite an interesting experience. And I don't think it was entirely their fault. I think I was much more naive in those days, and I think I could have I could have presented the message to the policymakers and to industry in a different way, and it might have stood a better chance of actually getting across to them. So I hope I've learned from experience. But the point I want to make here is that by looking at the interactions between these three sectors, you're able to make much more accurate predictions. I wouldn't say that you can ever predict with any certainty what's likely to happen, but if you understand the key interactions in the whole system that you're talking about, then you are much more able to understand what's likely to happen in the long run. And I also think that at least one person in a group that's doing this kind of research has to have all of this in their head at once. It really doesn't work if you're relying on three different experts in three different areas and expecting them to do the integration. There has to be a really senior integrator in a group that's doing this kind of research in order to make the integration happen. So, when we were asked to do the OECD analysis of the healthcare sector, we based it on the outcome of some of the Innogen Centre's research in the first 5 years of its life, from 2002 to 2007. And really, we'd been studying regulation in life science and what's happening to innovation, mainly in big multinational companies, but also small companies. And there's been a very strong sense, and I think somebody's mentioned it already today, of failure to deliver the expected biotech revolution, that there were such enormous expectations in the 1970s, 1980s, huge investments going in, and an overall perception of failure to deliver. And there was an Ernst & Young report, I think, last year, which summed up all the investment that had gone into life sciences since the 1980s and summed up all the outcomes, and it almost broke even. So we've not actually made a lot of money out of all this investment. And Gary Pisano from Harvard has another interesting analysis where he shows that what's been happening is that companies have been trading intellectual property with one another. They've not been actually delivering anything at the end of the day. And so you add value to the intellectual property the further you go down the clinical trials route, but you never actually get to a product at the end of the day from biotech. This is not small molecule drugs, but biotech. So there's a failure to deliver. And if you actually look at what a comparison with IT, in the IT area, you know, since the 1970s, you've seen several major revolutions where a small company with a big idea has moved into the market, taken over, made a fortune, changed the life of everybody, customers and competitors, and really made a difference. And you don't see that in life science. It just hasn't happened. And there's some discussion around linear models of innovation and so on. And I had, in fact, I've got a paper with a colleague, Robin Williams, looking at the difference between IT and life sciences in terms of linear models. And when you look at life sciences, it's pretty linear. You know, it's a pipeline, for goodness sake. And what's that if it's not linear? And the reason it's got that characteristic is the role of regulation. The pipeline is there to comply with the regulatory process. So what we've been saying is, you know, let's look at it from the other side of things. You know, people have been saying for at least 10 years that the pharmaceutical industry innovation model is dead on its feet. Why is it still standing? Well, the reason it's still standing is the regulatory system, because nobody else with a competing innovation can come into the marketplace and get to a marketplace without going through the pharmaceutical industry, because they're the only ones with deep enough pockets to get a product through to the marketplace. So the only innovations that get through to the marketplace are the ones that conform with the strategies of the multinational companies. So instead of regulation being one factor among many that influence the industry, it's actually the dominant factor in life sciences. And I've had loads of conversations with economists about why they don't take account of this in their models. And the usual answer I get is, well, our models are not capable of coping with regulation, so we just treat it as a background factor. I'm still looking for the economist who's open-minded enough to try and do something about this. I'd love to hear from one. So it causes constraints on innovation, barriers to entry. And you get this lock-in phenomenon. And you've actually got a symbiotic relationship between the industry and the regulators, and it's built up over the years. And the industry was very well aware of this factor of innovation creating a barrier to entry and stopping competition from coming into their sector. And they supported it, at least partly for that reason. It also helps venture capital to invest as well. But one of the reasons was this kind of symbiotic relationship which built up, and a supportive relationship between the industry and the regulators, which has actually become increasingly rigid and sclerotic, and you now have an innovation which is an innovation system which is really problematic and really can't change. And that's one of the reasons why you've got not so much innovation in life science as you have in IT. And I've said in capitals at the bottom there, and the sclerosis is spreading. And let me just give you one example. When we think about something new that comes on the scene, new science, new innovation, let's take stem cells as an example, the regulators cast around and say, how are we going to regulate stem cells? And the answer in this case has been, we'll regulate them as if they were drugs. Now, the impact of that is going to be that nobody can afford to develop stem cells as therapies, but they will develop stem cells as adjuncts to toxicity testing in pharmaceutical companies. So your your regulatory system is actually spreading this sclerosis into other areas. And I've heard a rumour lately that the new science of synthetic biology, which is quite exciting, is going to be regulated in Europe as if it was a GM crop. And what's that going to do to innovation, I would ask. So this was our starting point then, that regulation was the key problem. And if you want change, you have to change the regulatory system. And we came up with 3 alternative visions of the future, which, there it is, yeah. We came up with 3 alternative visions of the future. The first one wasn't there in our first draft. We didn't consider things carrying on pretty much as at present. We focused on radical disruptive change and managed evolution. And we presented the radical disruptive change, which is what happens when big pharma really collapses and falls over because the pressures get too great. We had that one and the managed evolution in the first scenario paper that we gave to OECD. And some of the members on the OECD panel didn't like it at all. Particularly, they have a group of industry people who were not very comfortable with the implications of this. But also it didn't fit with the kinds of scenario that 2 of the parallel projects were doing. So they asked us to focus more on the first one and the third one. Things carry on pretty much as present. So you won't find the second scenario in the paper that's on the website. But I'll talk about it a little bit. But I'll start first with the no change scenario. And this is a storm in a teacup. And I think what we're seeing here, and this is what's happening at the moment in the pharmaceutical industry, you've got a series of small perturbations going on, and the company responds in a piecemeal fashion. Regular episodes of turbulence, and resolved by piecemeal tinkering and no big strategic change at all. So, there's a current fashion at the moment among companies. They're all focusing their R&D pipelines. They've decided what they need to do in order to stay solvent is to focus on areas of expertise, and they're sacking people like mad and focusing on a restricted set of research areas. And for anybody who's a researcher, this is a fantastic time to get people to open up and talk about the industry. Very hard to get people who are still employed in the industry to talk about it. But if you can catch somebody who's just been sacked, you'll get wonderful insights into the industry. And we've done that from time to time. So you know, you've got previously, the previous fashion was for self-contained independent research units. So companies would spin out little independent research units, centres for exploitation of drugs, CEDDs, GlaxoSmithKline started it off, centres for exploitation of drugs in development or something like that. And we were very lucky a couple of years ago in getting Professor Roses from GlaxoSmithKline to come and give us a talk in the Edinburgh International Science Festival on translational medicine, and he headed the translational medicine CEDD. We were really surprised about how easy it was to get him to come, and the fact that he didn't want us to pay him anything for his fare or anything like that. And it turned out that GlaxoSmithKline were closing his unit, so he was very keen to talk about pharmacogenomics and its role in the world and so on. So the thing about this, though, is that it's a slow build-up of tension within the industry sector. And I think there will come a point when you will get something like the current financial crisis, only on a smaller scale, but in the pharmaceuticals. I've just got an article in this magazine, Britain in 2009. It's an ESRC magazine, and I've written an article about the pharmaceutical industry, which I've called Bioengineering a Black Swan. And it's based on the black swan ideas that Nassim Taleb has in his book. But actually, I don't agree with him, because he says that these big catastrophic events are always unpredictable. And I think they're not. There are lots of people predicting them. It's just that nobody knows what trigger to press to stop them. You know, it's a self-perpetuating. There's no incentives for anybody to get off the treadmill. And so, but a lot of people know it's a problem. Now, could it possibly be that an industry sector could re-engineer itself successfully before it collapses? And that was the idea that we picked up in the third scenario. But I'll stick with this one for a minute. You get no major disruptive change, seriously suboptimal, continuing lack of path-breaking innovation. Disappointment leads to a decline in public and commercial investment. You get inexorable increases in regulatory burdens, because every time something goes wrong, the regulatory system is added to more complexity in order to make sure that that particular kind of thing doesn't happen again. You get more conflict, societal conflict from selective availability of drugs for the wealthy. The public perception of the industry is seriously worse than it used to be. You get patient groups who have been strong supporters of the pharmaceutical industry beginning to lose confidence in the ability of the companies to deliver benefits. So the sector becomes dominated by a set of complex, rigid, long-established systems resistant to change. Eventually, the big R&D intensive pharmaceutical companies will be commodity producers rather than R&D intensive companies. That would be the logical outcome at the end of the day. And you're actually seeing that happen 10 years ahead. I think the agrochemical industry is 10 years ahead of pharmaceuticals in this sense. And if you look at the big pharma, the big agrochemical companies, they're commodity producers and not R&D based. Aggressive competition between companies. You might get modest increases in public health profiles and lifespans, but it would be coming from better diets and more exercise rather than medical interventions. And there are quite a lot of people who think that's the way we should go anyway, so that would not necessarily be problematic. So then this is the radical disruptive change scenario. And I was, until fairly recently, optimistic of the possibility of avoiding this kind of scenario. This is the real storm. And I think the current financial crisis could eventually lead to nervousness about the ability of the pharmaceutical sector to ride out the crisis. Interestingly enough, you know, their profits seem to be increasing rather than decreasing, and their share prices seem to be holding up. And I wonder whether it's just because, in comparison with everybody else, they actually look quite healthy. And in the kingdom of the blind, you know, the one-eyed man is ruling. So, but you know, I think that this possibility, the radical disruptive change, may actually be more likely to happen than it might otherwise have been. Just a brief summary of some of the things we considered about small storms and teacups adding up to a big one. How many small storms does it take? When do you get the tipping point? And that's one of the things that's really hard to predict, is when it's going to happen. You can know for sure it will happen someday, but some things can carry on surprisingly long time. But you've currently got, you know, and you'll see more of this in the future, companies cutting staff, more targeted pipelines, lots of new R&D strategies being tried out on a fairly piecemeal, non-strategic basis, and more outsourcing of early stage research and development. So you've got a lot of small companies doing apparently innovative research in the life science area, but they're all marching to the tune of the big pharma companies. And so one of the things we said in one of the scenarios was that the problem with innovation pipelines is less a failure of innovation, and it's more a mismatch between the nature of the new biotechnology innovations, the nature of the companies that could best exploit those innovations, and the public and patient expectations of new drugs and treatments, and the regulatory systems that have actually been designed around 20th century models of drug development are totally unsuitable for the 21st century science. So that could lead to major disruption, a bullish defense by big pharma companies of their model, which doesn't work. A new breed of CEOs brought in from outside, and you've already seen some of this happen, where CEOs have been brought into pharmaceutical companies from commercial, more finance-related areas, coming into the pharmaceutical company and saying, hey, shake yourselves up, boys, we want you to do this innovation lark a bit faster than you've been doing it in the past, you know. And it's not possible. That's one of the problems. So you get a new wave of mergers and acquisitions, takeover of small and medium-sized companies increasing. And also what we've actually seen is many more takeovers of the middle-sized pharmaceutical companies. Things that Novo Nordisk hasn't been taken over yet, but Organon has, Ferring Pharmaceuticals has. And what we had thought in our first version of this scenario was that these would be the companies that would inherit the mantle of developing new innovative drugs for smaller markets, but more targeted markets with lower profit margins, and that would be acceptable to a middle-sized company, but not to a big pharmaceutical multinational. And so you finally reach a tipping point. Lack of investment leads to the demise of R&D, and you know, no more R&D-based pharmaceutical companies, basically. And in my view, that would be a problem, because I actually want the new drugs for Alzheimer's before I get it, and so I think it's in our interest, because they're the only guys who can do it, really. It's in our interest that they carry on. So let's see what we can do to help them. So if we've got managed evolution, this was our optimistic scenario, and it's really fuzzy. I'm sorry, it's not coming over well. I pinched it off a website, that's why. However, it's a beautiful landscape with a rainbow, and some cows in the fields here, a little village and a church, and the rainbow up here, and some nice green fields over there. And so this is the bright, shiny future. And we were speculating who will own the green pastures in this bright, shiny future? What will the cash cows be producing? And what religion will be in charge of the church? And so that's a kind of summary of the kind of thing we were beginning to think about. And the scenario was based on the assumption that certain things had to happen in just the right sequence for this to take place. And that was the really dodgy bit. It was all possible, but there were so many points at which A had to happen just before B, or you'd lose the opportunity. That's what made it very difficult to see how you could make this happen. But the first thing we thought had to happen was that the regulators changed their attitude to the process of regulation that they were developing. And we had this vision of a situation where major multinationals in the pharmaceutical sector were having a conference with major multinationals in the IT sector and trying to think about how they could learn from one another. And if they could actually merge together, what could they do as a joint company, perhaps developing delivering health care for a profit rather than delivering drugs. And that was the kind of vision we had. And when we gave the first draft of this scenario to OECD, they said, oh, I can't quite work out what you're suggesting here. I can't imagine how this might ever happen. And just by chance, one of them was in a meeting in Washington 3 weeks later, where exactly that was happening. And it was big IT companies and big pharma companies talking to one another. And they could not see any way to make a profit jointly. And they couldn't envisage how they could do it, but then nobody was talking about changing the regulatory system. And so we thought that regulatory innovation was the key to all of this. And in order to get it, you need a pretty strong vision and sense of direction among policymakers and regulators. And better understanding of the far-reaching potential of regulatory innovation to change the whole course of an industry. And I think that's beginning to happen, particularly in the Food and Drugs Administration in America. You are seeing a few people, for example, involved with the critical path project in the FDA, where they're actually trying very hard to change the way regulators